Hey friends, Ethan Fogg, Canandaigua Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here with Carrie Book from the United Way of Ontario County.
Hi, folks.
We're excited to welcome you to this installment of the 2021 Virtual Not-for-Profit Summit. Yes, we understand most of the world has returned to operating normal, but we also know that some folks in healthcare and other environments may still have some limitations. Let's not also overlook labor limitations and things that are other influences that are making it more appropriate for us to deliver to you in your inbox rather than asking you to meet us somewhere this year. Don't mistake us, live next year, that's the deal. But in the meantime, you get to share us over coffee perhaps with your colleagues or friends, or even at the breakfast table or at the beach, wherever you can get internet. Please, we think these modules will be helpful for you. And what's the first one, Carrie?
The first one is Dr. Joseph Frantagrossi and Ashley Lewis from the Family Counseling Services of the Finger Lakes, talking about culture change in your organization. Culture change, not exactly what you might think, but it's a deep dive into trauma-informed care and what does that mean for your organization.
Well, because for those of you who may not know, the United Way moved in my building in January. Definitely some culture change. We're still smiling. We're getting it, but there's a little trauma. And to keep it, to be fair to the audience, trauma-informed care is really a construct that reminds all of us that all of those who we work with or who may work for us have lives outside of work. And the people we may serve professionally have lives outside of work. And it's important for us to understand that context in order to manage them in the most effective way, whether we're helping them manage a recovery or helping them manage their workload. I guess the bottom line is together we can do more,
Sure.
But especially if we're more informed of what the context would be.
Sure. So trauma-informed care, this session will offer you an insight to the Finger Lakes Resiliency Network that will be kicking off later this fall. So I hope you tune in and join us.
And in the meantime, here's to you.
Live in 2022. See you then.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for clicking on this presentation and joining us today. My name is Joe Fantagrossi, and I am here representing Family Counseling Service of the Finger Lakes, along with Ashley Lewis and Nicole Fess. And we want to get right into it today. We know your time is valuable, and we want you to have the opportunity to learn about our topic and the opportunity to reflect upon what you're going to see today. So the first thing we're going to ask you to do, and you can do this right along with the video, or you can feel free to pause the video and do it. I'd ask you to take a look at the picture that is on your screen and either jot down or in your mind a caption or a short description of what you see. Again, we'll offer several reflection opportunities throughout this video, and you can take them in whatever way works best for you. So one interpretation of this is regarding an overall sense of empathy and compassion. If you look back at the graphic, one person can't see the pressure the other person is under, and the other can't see the pain. And so having empathy, knowing that everyone is fighting their own battles, basing your viewpoint out of compassion is the core of trauma and resilience work. And we'll talk a lot more about that today. I am pleased today to be joined by Ashley Lewis, and I will now ask her to introduce herself.
Thanks, Joe. My name is Ashley Lewis. I am the Director of Clinical Services for Family Counseling Services of the Finger Lakes. I've been in the mental health field for about 10 years. The last 7 years of that 10, I've been heavily focused on treating individuals that have been impacted by trauma. I specialize in sexual abuse treatment and working with children that have experienced physical abuse and other traumas. This work is something I am personally and professionally passionate about. I'm very aware that therapy is a very powerful and healing tool, but that longevity of progress is really impacted by how our communities and organizations respond to the individual. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Joe Fantagrossi, and I'm currently serving as the Director of Intervention and Professional Development for Finger Lakes Community Schools, which is part of the Family Counseling family. I am in year 25 as an educator, and in the last 7 years, I've really focused on the grant world with a concentration on trauma and resilience. This work for me is both personal and professional, as I myself am a survivor of significant childhood trauma. So I am really excited about the opportunity today to share some of this work and information with you. If you are someone who utilizes the digital atmosphere or is involved in social media, we'd ask you to follow us on our social media accounts. We update those very often. The handle is the same on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at FLX Resilience. We also have a website that we are proud of, flxresilience.org. And if you have any questions after today's presentation, please contact us by email at flrn@fcsfl.org. And we will be glad to get back to you and answer any of your questions or provide any support or resources that we can. So today's agenda, we're going to open up by talking a little bit about self-care, because both Ashley and I agree that self-care is the first step to this important work. Then we're going to talk about how does trauma happen? What role does stress play in that? Then how do we combat trauma and toxic stress? By looking at empathy and compassion and the hope of resilience. And ultimately, we're going to spend the last few minutes of our presentation talking about what actions an organization can take and a person can take in terms of combating trauma, both personal trauma and trauma that is present in institutions and communities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ashley to talk about self-care.
Thanks, Joe. So I actually watched Joe do a training, I think it was 1.5 years or 2 years ago, and he started that training with a conversation about self-care. And I remember having follow-up conversations about how he started his trainings with self-care because it has to start with the individual. And you can't show up for other people if you don't first show up for yourself. So that's always resonated with me. And now when I engage in trainings, we always make sure that there's that component about self-care. I really like the way that Dr. Bruce Perry references self-care in some of his research and books. He references self-care as monumental in regards to self-regulation and what are we doing to promote that regulation within ourselves. That regulation is rhythmic, patterned, predictable, safe. What is it that we're doing for ourselves to heal? We have to show up and take care of ourselves before we can then engage in organizations and work with our clients in a healing-centered way that promotes their resiliency as well. So we're going to take a minute just to ask you to reflect. What is it that you're doing for yourself to refuel? What are the activities or the conscious efforts that you make within your own personal lives to refuel, to heal, to recharge? So when we have this conversation about self-care, I think that there are times in which people really reflect on self-care as an activity, something to engage in, whether that means taking a bubble bath or going for a massage. But self-care is really more of a conscious effort internally and engaging external resources and people that support our own personal healing. So sometimes self-care is setting healthy boundaries for ourselves. I'm shutting off work at 5 o'clock because for me, that's what I need for myself and my family to refuel and to regroup for the following day. Maybe some boundaries are taking that PTO that you've been waiting to use. So you're able to disconnect from work and really focus on what you're needing and what other people in your life are needing from you. When we look at self-care as being something that we're using for regulation, it's really important that it's predictable, it feels safe, and it's something that we are consciously putting into our routine. And we're also utilizing self-care as a tool for self-compassion and empathy for ourselves, and recognizing that sometimes expectations might not feel realistic, and we're not internalizing that as shame, and we're using that as a stepping stone to assess what is appropriate for me within my ability right now. So a tool that can be really helpful in kind of assessing and understanding where you are personally in your self-care journey is the ProQual. It is a quality of life scale. It's a quick and easy assessment that kind of examines where you are with compassion satisfaction, burnout. Are you recharging? Are you refueling? Are you getting that compassion satisfaction? I think of that as the feel good of our profession, those slam dunks, stepping stones to resiliency through the successes that we're seeing within our own personal lives and within the clients that we work with. Understanding where we are helps us to determine what our next steps are in regard to preventing burnout, stress response, and promoting that self-care. So self-care planning, we start with cultivating that awareness. So that ProQual could be used really as that assessment tool to tell us, is what we're doing working? If not, what can we start doing? What should we stop doing? And what should we keep doing? So what's working, what's not working for us? Sometimes when we present this assessment tool, we then discuss how to create a concrete self-care plan, something that's realistic for us in our lifestyles. But I'm always really conscious of discussing that need for self-compassion and empathy. So if you create this beautiful self-care plan, but then you're beating yourself up because you were going to go for that walk at lunch, but you didn't, then how valuable is that self-care plan? It's really about that internal empathy and the wondering what's working and what's not working for ourselves without that layer of internalizing if we don't do exactly what it is we think we're supposed to be doing in regard to that self-care plan.
And so the basis of that work in self-care comes because we need to have a response to stress. And as I was looking up images for stress, this image came up. So it can't all be serious. So every once in a while, we do try to give a slight laugh or at least a chuckle on a very serious topic. So the first concept for today is, what is stress? So again, this is a personal reflection opportunity. You can pause the video at this moment, or you can just keep letting it roll, whatever works best for you and your learning style. But I'd like you to consider what stress means to you, how you would personally define it in your own life. Because that really is the premise of this work, is it's coming through your own lens. And so Dr. Stuart Shanker, who has done quite a bit of work on regulation and self-regulation and is based out of Canada, defines stressors as this. And so if we utilize Dr. Shanker's concept, What we're really saying is stress in and of itself is not necessarily negative, but it is a consumption of energy. And if we wanted to break that down even more closely, we could identify 3 general types of stress. The top circle represents positive stress, sometimes called eustress. That would be a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevation of stress hormone levels. I would say that is often the type of stress that an actor feels before they take the stage for a performance, or an athlete feels before they play a game. The second type on the left of the screen is tolerable stress, sometimes referred to as negative. That is a serious type of stress, but it is temporary. So it does lead to an increased heart rate. It does lead to an elevation of those stress hormones again. But negative or tolerable stress can be balanced out by supportive relationship. It can also be balanced out by protective factors. And we're going to talk more about protective factors when we move further into the presentation today. The type of stress we'll focus most on today is the most damaging type of stress, and that is referred to as toxic stress. Toxic stress is prolonged. It is a prolonged activation of our stress response system. And when there is no counterbalance, when someone does not have the resiliency factors or the protective factors that balance out toxic stress, when they don't have, for example, a clear self-care plan, toxic stress can turn into trauma. One other visual way to look at this is with this simple X-Y axis diagram. Performance and level of stress. As your level of stress increases to a certain aspect, your performance will increase. We know from study and research that it is hard to operate at our optimal condition if we don't have some level of stress. And you can see at the top of that curve is positive or eustress. But once we get on the other side of the curve and the stress comes to a level that is no longer tolerable, it can quickly turn into distress. And so what we wanted to take a minute to do is to show you what that looks like internally. And so we have a clip for you that we're going to share to show you that internally.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
And we're so fortunate today to have Ashley on the line with us, because she will take that general understanding of the stress response system and more fully explore it in this next segment.
Thanks, Joe. So like Joe had mentioned, and in the video, it highlights that toxic stress for an extended period of time can equate to trauma. How the brain interacts with anything that is interpreted as threatening, the brain will do anything it needs to do to survive. And that information is processed through that lower part of the brain that is absolutely designated to that survival piece. So there's use dependence. The more we are needing to use the part of our brain for survival, that will be the strongest part of our brain, impacting those connections that work with our feeling and our thinking. So information is translated from the brainstem through the limbic system up to that top part of the brain and then back down. So if you're exposed to healthy and nurturing, consistent environments, then in a perfect world, perfect circumstance, those connections are going to be strong, and that information transfer is going to work very well. So I like this quote a lot when we're talking about trauma. Trauma is not the event, trauma is the response. So if you're constantly exposed to that prolonged or chronic trauma, that chronic stress, the brain is constantly on high alert, and that reaction is stored in the brain. So then we're exposed to any stimuli that is similar to what we've experienced during a traumatic event or during a time of ongoing stress. We're going to respond in the same way. So I think about that picture that we had, like stress, desserts is spelled stress backwards. So once upon a time, those maladaptive strategies, such as using food for comfort or engaging in some self-destructive behaviors, were once adaptive strategies that no longer serve us purpose. But until the brain is retrained through those positive and healthy connections with other human beings, that healthy, predictable relationship, then it's not going to have that free flow of information, that connection and that understanding. And each individual responds differently to the trauma and the stress based on those protective factors and that healthy foundation that existed or didn't exist during those very detrimental points of development. The shift really should be we should stop asking what is wrong with someone to what has happened to someone, to how we can promote healing within someone. So the ACEs study occurred in the late 90s with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. It was a revolutionary study because it was one of the first times that we really started to examine that relationship and that connection between adversity and trauma experienced in early childhood. The study implicated that individuals that were exposed to those risk factors, the adversity, the trauma, that chronic stress, had implications later in life, such as substance use concerns, health implications, mental health, cognitive concerns as well. So this study really highlighted that there is that relationship and that correlation between that ongoing and prolonged stress and how we respond to others and those around us.
And so one of the things that we've learned over time is that, yes, there is an individual trauma response, it directly related to that initial study that Ashley just spoke to, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. But we also have a greater understanding that there is a second type of ACEs, and that's adverse community experiences. And whether that be a discussion of the impact of discrimination or poor housing or violence in a community, we realize that there are historical traumas and that there are community and neighborhood-based traumas. And so when we have this conversation about trauma, it is not solely individual, but it can also be community and institutionally based. And so we really try to remember as we're doing this work that ultimately it is our goal to help those who have experienced trauma. It is an even broader goal for us to stop them from having to experience that trauma in the first place. And so the work that Ashley does specifically is tied to that response of those who have experienced trauma. And a lot of the work that I'm fortunate enough to do is trying to find ways to not ask adults to be so resilient so that they can have less traumatic experiences in their life. And that ties directly both the historical community trauma, adverse community experiences, and the personal adverse childhood experiences ties directly not only to our social emotional wellness, but also to the development and use of our brain.
So as I mentioned in the previous slide, it's that use dependency piece. So when we're looking at this visual right now, on your left-hand side, there is a brain that developed in a healthy environment. And then on the right-hand side is the brain of a child that's experienced abuse. So when we're looking at that use dependence, you can see that the bottom of the brain on the right-hand side is more developed than the middle and the top portions of the brain. That's because our brain develops from the bottom up and then back down. And so that bottom piece of the brain is really responsible for keeping us alive. So when we're experiencing that ongoing stress or that trauma, our brain is responding, alerting us that we need to do something to survive. It doesn't necessarily create the same synaptic connections, that limbic system in that top part of the brain, because coping strategies that are up here at the top part of our brain or reasoning skills are not as important as making sure we stay alive. So it's that use dependency portion. And when we're experiencing too much stress for too long, it has a negative impact on this brain development and our overall well-being. The brain is the most malleable at a young age, prior to the age of 18, but new synaptic connections can always be created well into adulthood. It's just not as easy. So we're going to take another moment to offer reflection. You can either pause the video or keep us rolling. Just taking a moment to reflect on how might people in your current organization potentially have experienced trauma.
And that's such a pertinent question at this point, Ashley, because for the first time in almost all of our lives, we have experienced a universal worldwide trauma in a pandemic. And so I think that's one lens that everyone has to look through in their own way. And so as we're speaking to mostly members of organizations in our region, I think this question is really pertinent to the service we're providing to our clients moving forward, but maybe just as pertinent, if not more, how are we supporting each other within the agencies and organizations? So I really appreciate that question.
we're going to take a moment to watch a clip by Dr. Siegel. He is going to demonstrate the hand model of the brain and how the brain responds to stress, as we've been discussing.
One of the most rewarding experiences for me has been to study brain science and apply it to the experience of parenting. And the hand model of the brain that I use to teach parents is very useful to understand that. So if you take your thumb and put it in the middle of your palm, put your fingers over the top, this is a very useful model of the brain. And when we can actually see in front of us what's going on in the brain, then we can change what the brain does. So let me walk you through very basically what happens in this brain and the structures in it. And it goes like this. The spinal cord comes up representing the wrist, and then you have coming up into the skull the brain stem and the limbic area, which work together to help regulate arousal and your emotions and the way you have a fight, flight, freeze response. These are below the cortex, the limbic and brainstem areas, and the cortex is this higher part of the brain that allows us to perceive the outside world, to think and reason. And this frontmost part of the brain, right behind your forehead, so the person's oriented like this, is actually the part that regulates the subcortical, limbic, and brainstem areas. This regulation is very important because sometimes we can have all sorts of things happen in our life. We're tired, we're exhausted, someone pushes a particular emotional button, and we can flip our lids. So rather than being tuned in and connected and balanced and flexible, we can lose all of that flexibility, even lose moral reasoning, and act in ways that are terrifying to others, including our children. Now, you can actually bring yourself back online and come back to the high road and make a repair with your child, and that's important to explain to them. And you can also use this hand model of the brain to explain to children, even as young as 5 and 6, how to understand when their emotions are rising up from the brainstem and limbic areas here, and how it's overriding the prefrontal area and making it so they may be about to flip their lids. So I've had kids come tell me that they're about to go flip their lids and they need a break. They need a timeout. And by even just naming that, they can tame it. And that's the power of using the hand model for ourselves and our children to help us all make sense of what goes on in the emotional communication that we have in the course of day-to-day life.
I really love that clip that we just watched, and I love how he explained the way that we can use that hand model to discuss these trauma responses, even to children that are 5 or 6. I think that knowledge is power, and I think this knowledge is extremely beneficial for adults as well. So we have these 4 responses. So you experience a trauma, a very stressful stimuli, and we can respond in a couple different ways. There's fight, so fighting back, trying to defend ourselves physically. There's flight, so running away or trying to escape the stressful situation or the trauma that's happening. Freeze is that complete shutdown, that disassociation. Disassociation is really a continuum. It could be as minor as daydreaming to full-blown dissociative identity. That is extremely, extremely rare. But I like to mention that it is very much a continuum, and it's just that separation between what's happening in front of us and our conscious thinking. And then there's also fawn. So fawning is that people-pleasing. Engaging with an individual in a way that you perceive to have the least cause for reaction from that other person. When we experience those ongoing stressors and our brain is responding in a certain way, if we then again experience those same stressors, our brain is going to respond in the same way. So it goes back to the idea of what once was adaptive to help us survive can then become maladaptive later. So that's where that self-awareness piece is really important, like we discussed previously. With my work with kids, I often see the flight, freeze, or fawn, more particularly even that freeze or fawn, because children can't always run away from a trauma. They can't run away from a perpetrator. And so what we know is that use dependence, those synaptic connections are being created. So then even as adults, you might see that adult responding to stress by trying to appease, trying to please whoever it is they perceive as bringing on that stressor. So maybe taking on more work, offering to do more tasks with your boss to try to appease any stress response or avoid any stress response. So I think that's where it's really important for us to utilize not only empathy with ourselves, but those universal precautions with those that we're working with.
Thank you for mentioning that, Ashley, and I think that's a good transition for us to go from this look at toxic stress and trauma and the causes to, okay, now what do we do about it? What are the strategies, coping mechanisms? What is the path forward? Because in no way, shape, or form is ACEs something that is a life sentence. It is a challenge. It can create obstacles, but with the right work, we can move forward and we can find success and happiness. And both Ashley and I believe that that starts with empathy and compassion. And we think Dr. Brene Brown does a nice job of explaining that concept here.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
And so that always gets me. And so that is a good opening, a good foundation, that concept of empathy, for what we often call the antidote to trauma, which is resilience. And that is the good news that we are here to share with you today, is that resiliency overcomes adverse childhood experiences. And we've been doing this work for a long time. And the next clip we're going to show you has its childish moments, and it's a little offbeat, but does a really nice job of explaining how resiliency is built in the brain and what it looks like to overcome trauma with coping mechanisms. We'll be able to show a part of that clip to you today, but you are also free to look it up. All of our clips, including this one, are located on YouTube.
Brains. They are everywhere. In the world's gentlest places and its harshest. In this unforgiving environment, some brains exhibit troubling signs. Addiction, illness, depression, social disorder. Yet others thrive. Why have some brains developed the ability to cope in harsh conditions while others struggle? It is one of nature's great secrets.
Hi. Hello? This is amazing. But I just need to clarify a few things. This great secret? It's actually science. Severe adversity isn't good for any brain. But it is true that some brains do better than others in the face of significant challenges.
Oh, a scientist. Yes, I agree. This is a great secret of science.
Great, yes, but not a secret. Let me explain. We're born with brains, but our brains change as we grow. They develop based on experiences we have, and different brains respond to experiences in different ways. Okay, thanks. I'll let you get back to it.
Indeed. Some brains show robustity and strongitude, while others...
Sorry, we scientists use the word resilience. Some brains are more resilient than others.
Yes, resiliensis.
Resilience?
Resilience. Revenge of the cortex.
Resilience is a result of the interplay between genes and life experiences. It's a brain's ability to maintain good functioning under adversity.
Resilience makes us invincible.
Nothing makes us invincible. What resilience does is to give less leverage to negative factors in our lives and tip the balance in favor of positive outcomes.
Resilience. Fate's legendary prize.
Whoa, no! Some people are born with more resilience than others, but resilience can also be built over time. It's a big project involving parents, caregivers, teachers,
Kith, kin, karaoke comrades,
soccer coaches, counselors,
pastry chefs, associate producers, even millennials. Like a barn raising in times of old.
Yeah. In fact, we scientists believe strong brain architecture is the foundation for resilience. And, look over there.
Oh, yes. A young brain returns after months of isolation and adversity. No words can describe what this poor brain has suffered.
There are words that describe it. We scientists call it toxic stress.
Toxic stress lies in wait.
No. Stress happens inside the body. It's the fight or flight system kicking in. But if stress hormones are elevated too high and for too long, it can have negative effects on the brain and body.
Stress, a nasty poison.
Not all stress, just toxic stress. With the right supports, we can make severe stress tolerable, which means it won't do lasting damage. Stress can even be positive because it helps us to learn problem solving and coping skills. which leads us back to resilience.
Alas, this brain is resilience-less.
No, it isn't. Let me explain. Remember when I talked about giving less leverage to negative experiences and tipping the scale in a positive direction? Well, here's a little something I've been working on. It's a really amazing metaphor. Here goes. I call it the resilience scale.
Resilience scales. Protective armor plates that
Shiny! But no. The resilience scale helps us understand why some brains are more resilient than others.
The resilience scale sends out invisible resilience rays
It's really just a scale. See? It's a beam being held up by a fulcrum.
full of crumbs.
Geez, no! A fulcrum. You know, like high school Never mind. Let me just clean this up. See, negative experiences add weight to one end of the beam, and positive factors add weight to the other end. Ideally, we want the scale to tip toward the positive side and lead towards positive life outcomes.
The brain's future literally hangs in the balance.
The position of the fulcrum can be understood as our original capacity for resilience. It's something like our genetic starting position. Remember the young brain that was struggling to survive? Look, it started life with the fulcrum off-center, giving more leverage to negative experiences. Serious stuff, like abuse, neglect, and chaotic environments. That means positive factors like responsive relationships, safe environments, and learning opportunities had less leverage. Over time, the negative load shifted the fulcrum even farther in a negative direction.
Tragedy.
Not at all. Right now, this brain is experiencing poor health. But with help, the scale can be tipped toward more positive outcomes. The first thing we can do is to stop negative experiences from stacking up. Then, we can add more positive factors, loading up the positive side of the scale. And we're not done. We can work to shift the fulcrum in a way that favors positive outcomes.
The fulcrum, an amazing instant fix-it button.
No, it's a process. It involves many supportive people and plenty of time. Remember? This brain is still young, so adult brains can work with it to relieve toxic stress and teach coping skills. In early childhood, these efforts can push the fulcrum a considerable distance.
Childhood, filled with fascination and fulcrum flexibility.
Sort of, but there are other sensitive developmental periods that are windows of opportunity, like adolescence. And even if this brain doesn't get help until adulthood, change is still possible. It will take more support, and the change will be less dramatic. But any fulcrum can be moved to make positive outcomes more achievable.
And so hopefully you gather from that that the work that we do and the service that we provide for our clients and the relationships we build with them and the relationships we build with our colleagues are a critical part of moving along the trauma-informed continuum and creating a place that is safe and supportive and part of the healing process. In some ways, if you're looking for more information on this, what you're seeing on the screen there is negative experiences and positive supports will be referred to as risk factors versus protective factors. It's really the same concept. What has happened to you? What experiences have you had that have created toxic stress and trauma would be the red. And then what positives do you have that have helped you with coping and resilience would be in the green.
So if we take a moment to reflect on the topics that we've discussed and put those pieces together, we started today's presentation with that picture of two individuals with the rock and the snake, and they really didn't know one another's story. They really didn't know what each other were experiencing. So when I'm reflecting on that picture, I like to think in the same context as how we treat our clients and how we treat our coworkers. We don't need to know someone's story. We don't need to know someone's trauma to utilize those universal precautions and show up with empathy. In order for us to show up with empathy for other people, we have to show up for ourselves and practice that self-care and self-compassion and be empathetic towards ourselves before we can do that for other people. We know that self-care planning is important as it relates to stress. Too much stress for too long will have negative impact on our mind and body. But like that video reflects, resiliency is actually more of a predictive factor than our ACE score is. So the more we focus on building resiliency for ourselves, the more we're able to engage in those healthy connections with other people, whether that be our clients, our coworkers, our staff, and foster that resiliency and be healing centered. This is one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Bruce Perry. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. So when reflecting on the damage that chronic stress or trauma can do to that developing brain and onward, there's actually research that suggests that healthy, predictable relationships can heal that, not only emotionally, but even in those synaptic connections in our brains, we can foster new connections in our brain through that powerful healing of those human relationships.
And it's also critical that we have compassion and empathy for ourselves. It is very easy after seeing a presentation like this to think about all the times when we didn't show the depth of empathy that we could have. But I keep coming back to this Maya Angelou quote, and it has spoken to me a great deal in both my professional and personal experience. And that's the ability to grow, to learn, and to be better. And I think the reflection of this work is our opportunity to provide safe and supportive environments moving forward for those we serve, for those that we care for those that we work with, for those in our family and our friend circle. So one last reflection for today. We often use the statement in our work with the Resiliency Network that small is the new big. So I would ask, again, you can pause the video or just continue to roll on. What is one action item you're going to try as a result of this training? And again, please focus on the small. We're going to talk about institutional in just a minute to wrap today up. But for the moment, in that reflection, think about you as an individual, what action you can take that will have a small impact in making the environment you work in more trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive and ultimately healing-centered. Now, from the organizational perspective, we attempt to help organizations do that work as facilitators of the Finger Lakes Resiliency Network. FLRN has been around for 6 cohorts, and there are currently 13 organizations that are wrapping up a year in the cohort. Yes, they fought through both a pandemic and found time to do trauma-informed work. So we're very proud of them for that. The Resiliency Network came about to answer some of these why questions. First thing is that trauma is universal. It's a growing public health concern, and there is no one or no community or no institution, agency, or organization that is free from its impacts. Second is, much like 20 years ago when we were discussing helping someone who was bleeding and wearing gloves, being trauma-informed is a universal precaution because we have no idea of the experiences that someone has had and the type of care they need. So treating everyone with that level of dignity, respect, compassion, care, concern, and empathy is a universal precaution. And third, this work recognizes that it's not just the trauma impact for our clients, but it's also the impact on those we work with. And there's actually a very good book called Trauma Stewardship that talks a great deal about that. So at the Finger Lakes Resiliency Network, we are guided by 6 core values. These core values were adopted in our work with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association of the federal government. And we utilize those values to guide us in creating the necessary materials and curriculum to help organizations move along the trauma-informed continuum. We view this work in a 3-phased model. That model is not a train and pray model. It is a combination of training and coaching that is specific to each organization that joins us. We do have a cumulative curriculum map that was developed about 1.5 years ago, and we deliver much of that information through a workshop setting. But each organization also gets specific coaching sessions that are tied to their organization, and a coach that has not only been trained in trauma, but also trained in coaching. The content of our work is based on SAMHSA's 10 domains of implementation, which is a well-regarded and probably the grandfather, if you will, of all trauma-informed care work. And the action steps to this work are based on the organizational change manual from the ITTIC, the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, which is located or centralized in the School of Social Work at the University of Buffalo. For those who like more details, we are in the process of welcoming new members into the Resiliency Network. We will have a 6-month preparation process from July 1st to the middle of January. And that preparation will include an organizational self-assessment, access to a coach from the Resiliency Network, and a number of trainings at your disposal. We are kicking off our next full cohort of organizations in the Resiliency Network in January of 2022. In the meantime, we have a team led by Nicole, who's on the call, that have created a digital hub, which is a place that allows for networking. One of the things that we were hampered by during the pandemic was the network part of the Finger Lakes Resiliency Network, because we found it difficult to network when we couldn't physically be in the same space. So during that time, launched 2 months ago, we created a digital hub that creates a almost social media type atmosphere where people can exchange ideas, get additional resources, see and list job postings, come together for common grant opportunities, and become part of common communities. And every agency who joins the cohort is assigned a coach, and that coach works on the how. A lot of places will give you the what, but how does that translate to your specific organization? Another question I frequently get is, how long would this work take? The real answer is this work is ongoing and will always be a piece of the puzzle, but we estimate the initial work to establish a trauma-informed organization happens over the course of 3 phases. pre-implementation, implementation, and sustainability. And we also estimate that each phase takes approximately 1 calendar year. We base that work on the 10 key development areas outlined by the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care. In phase 1, organizations are asked to consider the 5 highlighted key development areas. In phase 2, they're asked to consider key development areas 3, 4, 6, and 7. And in phase 3, it's key development area number 10. And all the time, you're continually building on all of the key development areas. Ultimately, from a high up or macro level, we're asking organizations to move through the continuum, starting with awareness or being trauma informed. That means I know what trauma is, I know its impacts, I know the importance of resilience in my community. Next step would be trauma sensitive. We've reviewed our policies and procedures, and nothing we're doing is causing more harm. But we weren't comfortable stopping there, because do no harm is a good first step, but ultimately we're all responsible to be part of the healing process. And so while we were formulating this curriculum, we were fortunate to find the work of Dr. Sean Ginwright in the Flourish Agenda out of Oakland, California. And Dr. Ginwright speaks to the importance of creating a healing-centered environment. So we would be excited to answer any of your questions, to help you better understand how implementation across your agency will lead to better outcomes for your clients and your staff. Again, you can find out more information about us at FLX Resilience is our handle across the 3 social media platforms. flxresilience.org is our website with more info, and our email address is flrn@fcsfl.org. If you're someone who likes everything in one place, you can scan that QR code right there, and that will bring you to a page with all of our social media links. Our final ask for you today is to do this survey. If you scan it, it will bring you to a very brief survey. It should take you no more than about 3 minutes. And your feedback does matter. It really helps us shape what we do for the future of the work. If you've hung in this far, we're so appreciative and thankful of your time. We know that in the modern day, it is not easy to learn this way, but we take any opportunity we can to spread the word about trauma and resilience, so in the hopes that we can continually improve our outreach to those who need us the most. We are very much grateful of the work that you do, and know that the last year and a half has created extraordinary circumstances for anyone in the service industries. And so from the bottom of our heart, thank you so much for the sacrifices you have made to keep our communities alive and viable. It means the world that you have taken time from your life and sacrificed your energy and your resources and your time to make others' lives more livable. So thank you so much for that. Ashley, anything as we conclude?
I think that you said it really beautifully, Joe. So I just echo your gratitude. Thank you all for showing up and doing the great work that you're doing.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for your help today, Nicole. And please don't hesitate to reach out to us on any of our social media, website, or flrn@fcsfl.org. Take care and have a wonderful day.